Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Qualified immunity is something we've talked about before. That's the notion that police officers and others are shielded from being sued for things they do while they're on the job. And on some levels it makes sense, but it's gone to absurd lengths such that I've talked before about how a police officer was accused of stealing money from somebody's house on the job. And when they were sued, their defense wasn't, oh, we didn't steal the money. They said, you can't sue us because of qualified immunity. So even if we stole the money, too bad. And there's been other crazy cases. Now, lately, there have been little chips appearing in this where the Supreme Court has, on a couple occasions, sent one back down and said qualified immunity doesn't cover here, doesn't cover this. And the problem with qualified immunity is that it was invented by the Supreme Court. It's not a statute. There's no statute that says that this is the case, generally speaking. It came from a Supreme Court ruling where the Supreme Court just said, we think this should exist. And a lot of people accuse the Supreme Court of legislating from the bench, that is, passing laws when they're supposed to simply be reviewing cases. And this is an example of them doing that, qualified immunity. So I've mentioned before that you have two ways this could go away. One is the Supreme Court could reverse itself, which happens occasionally, but generally like once a century on something major. But they could reverse themselves and say, we were wrong. Or legislatures, governments around the country, state governments, city governments, could pass laws that say, qualified immunity does not apply to our police officers. And if that happened, then guess what? It would fix the problem. And so some municipalities are doing that. Here's a story from CNN by Taylor Romine and New York City. By the way, Allison, Brian, and John sent it to me. New York PD officers are no longer protected from civil lawsuits after City Council passes police reform legislation. The New York City Council passed a series of reforms to the New York Police Department on Thursday, including ending qualified immunity for officers, and that had protected them against civil lawsuits. The package of legislation included 5 bills and 3 resolutions that provide additional oversight and require more transparency from the NYPD. The City Council also adopted a policing reform plan mandated by a New York State executive order. This includes allowing the Civilian Complaint Review Board to investigate police, as well as giving the board final authority on discipline recommendations for officers. Previously, the police commissioner had the right to disregard recommendations, which was a point of concern in the past. But one of the most powerful moves by the council was eliminating qualified immunity. The term refers to the legal principle that protects government officials from a civil suit alleging they violated a person's rights, and which is a hotly debated topic across the country. By creating a new local civil right through legislation, New York City residents will be protected against unreasonable searches and seizures and excessive force, and bans officers from using qualified immunity as a defense. Other legislation passed, including mandates of a quarterly report on all traffic stops, the Department of Transportation taking over investigation for all crashes involving serious injury, and requiring new officers to live within city limits. Press passes for media outlets will now be issued through the mayor's office instead of the NYPD. The set of legislation was formed over a months-long engagement process with the New York City Police Reform and Reinvention Collaborative, which worked with the input of stakeholders, experts, and the community, according to the mayor's office. Quote is, "We believe the plan ratified today by the City Council reflects the themes brought forward with reforms that center squarely on bringing an end to such policing, the criminalization of poverty, and the lack of transparency and accountability in the NYPD." That is from the collaborative co-sponsors. We know there is more to be done. Now the work begins to implement this plan without delay and ensure that the city's budget is fully aligned. The mayor also praised the legislation and thanked the co-sponsors and other city leaders for their reforms. He said, "These reforms will confront centuries of over-policing. Together we'll make our city safer and fairer for generations to come." Now, the mayor's office said that all initiatives will be launched with some fully implemented in 2021. The city will also launch a commitments tracker on May 1st to monitor the progress. Now, in a statement to CNN, the police commissioner expressed concern over the legislation, specifically noting his inability to have the final say on discipline. Right now, the commissioner hires them, trains them, asks them to go in harm's way to keep New Yorkers safe. And if an officer breaks the rules, I discipline them and, if necessary, fire them. If I'm not doing that the right way, I am accountable. The buck stops here. To take that away from the commissioner, ask yourself who has the accountability then. No other city agency uses that system, nor does the FBI, the Secret Service, or the Marines. There's a reason for that. Because the FBI, the Secret Service, or the Marines are different than the New York Police Department. The Marines? Oh, no other city agency uses that system, nor does the FBI, the Secret Service, or the Marines. There's a reason for that. A coalition of several New York City police unions circulated roving billboards around the city on Thursday to express their strong opposition to the legislation. The New York City Police Benevolent Association, which represents approximately 24,000 officers, was one of the most vocal opponents in this effort. The president of the PBA issued a searing statement in response to the legislation's passage. Police officers are out in the street all day and all night trying to stop the bloodshed. Where are these city council members? Safe at home, hiding behind their screens and dreaming up new ways to give criminals a free pass. It won't get better unless New Yorkers shame the politicians into doing their jobs. The Legal Aid Society, which is a major player in holding the NYPD accountable, also opposed the legislation, saying the reforms ignored the community's calls for investment in non-police resources. And that's kind of a strange thing for them to say they're against this when it ended qualified immunity. You think they'd be in favor of that. But they blamed the mayor and said he had a genuine opportunity to implement urgently needed police reforms. He failed to do that, instead produced a plan that at best glosses over the deeply rooted systemic problems within the NYPD that plague the New Yorkers we serve. So, there's a bunch of stuff going on here. And I can't speak to all of the reforms of the police department simply because I don't have enough information in this article to know what those are. Taking away the disciplinary function from the chief of the police or the commissioner and giving it to somebody else, I see the guy's point. But the qualified immunity thing is a huge, huge deal. It's a huge, huge deal. And I've done so many videos on it, I don't want to get into it too deeply here. But what the U.S. Supreme Court has said is that if a police officer does something and a victim of what they've done comes forward and says that police officer violated my constitutional rights, the only way that that case will get to a jury is if you can prove that the right that the police officer violated has been explicitly found to violate the constitutional rights of somebody, and a court has so ruled. And so the problem is that the court can't rule the first time because nobody's ruled on it yet. And so when qualified immunity was invented, they said, well, you have to have these cases that act as precedent. Well, there weren't any. So out of the many, many cases that have been filed in this, almost all of them have been thrown out because there's no precedent. There's no precedent, no precedent. And so it was such a poorly thought out thing by the U.S. Supreme Court when they invented it that I think even now the Supreme Court's looking at it going, that's a problem. But it's so rare for the Supreme Court to actually just come right out and reverse something, to actually flip it and say, yeah, it's completely wrong. Remember that the Supreme Court that passed qualified immunity is not the exact same members that we have now, right? But that really doesn't matter because the Supreme Court as an institution has almost always been that way, that they're very rare to overturn something outright, which they're more likely to do regarding their own precedent. They're more likely to modify it, clarify it, chip away at it, and so on. So recently we had the case where the prisoner, I believe in Texas, who was forced to live in just inhumane conditions, sued and said that that was a violation of his constitutional rights. And the Supreme Court said, yes, it was. And it's kind of like, well, if that was, what about these other cases? And the notion that a police officer can steal from somebody and not know that that's a violation of the constitutional rights of that person, and it really just defies logic, So I, again, don't know that much about the other policing reforms here. I'm not going to get into that. But to end qualified immunity in a big city like New York is a big, big deal. Now, of course, if federal agents acting in New York or state police acting in New York, it's not going to apply to them. That's the weirdness of all of this. So it's going to take either a bunch of more sweeping laws at the state levels and the federal levels, or it's going to take the U.S. Supreme Court actually reversing itself. And I don't know if that could happen, so we'll see. But as of right now, New York and a few other places have done this too. But New York, obviously, the biggest city to do it so far, at least in the U.S. I understand. So Taylor Ramin wrote it for CNN. Allison, Brian, and John sent it to me. Thanks a lot. New York Police Department officers are no longer protected from civil lawsuits after City Council passes police reform legislation. Qualified immunity. One small step. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. Children are smarter than any of us. Know how I know this? I don't know one child with a full-time job in children.